Welcome to Global E-commerce Leaders Podcast. I'm Michael LeBlanc.
And I am Jim Okamura.
Matthew, welcome to the Voice of Retail podcast. It's a special edition, a special guest co-host, a crossover episode with the Global E-commerce Leaders Forum. That's a whole lot. How are you today?
I am doing well. How are you doing, Michael?
I am fantastic. It's great to see you. Where are we finding you today?
New York City, right in the center of Times Square.
Nice. And Jim Okamura, welcome. You're my special guest co-host, a crossover from the Guelph community. How are you, Jim?
Yeah, doing really well. Always good to see, Matt. We've known each other for a long time now.
Exciting. Well, listen, this has been just such a treat to get the two of you together. Now, Matthew, we've all known each other, Jim longer, but I've known you for several years as well as part of the Guelph community. But for those who may not know you or may not know Global E and what you do and what makes you special, tell us about who you are and what makes Global E special.
Yeah, for sure. Matt Merrilees, CEO for the North America business here at Global E. I would say what makes Global E special, especially during these times, a lot of what we're going to talk about now is helping brands scale international in a profitable way. And doing it with very little friction. So I think that there is quite a bit that we can cover today, but excited for the conversation and pleasure to meet all the listeners.
And how long you been in this crazy business they call supply chain? Like, you've been doing this for quite a while. You've seen up, downs, COVID, tariffs. You've seen the like of it. But how long have you been doing this for?
I don't know if I want to reveal my age, which will allow you to backward math into it. But no, I entered the international logistics world in 2005 and accelerated into this intersection of e-commerce, digital, international tariffs, all of the fun back in 2018 when we decided to really accelerate the U.S. market here at Global E. Started with three of us here in a WeWork and have expanded ever since. So
fantastic.
It's been a ride.
Well, I would say, starting a job at 14, you're a young fella. So
Great math. You must be using AI.
Exactly.
So, Matt, let's jump right into let's say, turbulent times. We see in global trade. The past 18 months certainly have been, I think, challenging, and the uncertainty hanging over so many brands that we talk to. But just for context, when we think of is this really peak supply chain disruption? Is it worse or better? The same perhaps as during the COVID era. How do you kind of see what we've been through and what we're still really going through today?
Yeah, no, it's a good question. I mean, I think when I look at the overall volatility and the disruption of the market, I would say it is more stable than the peak COVID years. I think disruption, and one of the things that I continue to hear as I interact with some of the largest global brands in the world, is that I would say disruption has become a bit more structural rather than temporary. And when you think about volatility and what these brands are facing, it's become a strategy and more of a norm, and how to become a bit more agile, I would say, in these ever so changing times.
And that agility, as we know, is super, critical these days. And I think, that's what we've, been hearing, from others in terms of the importance of scenario planning. For example, I think more brands are almost prepared for these kinds of, disruption. Do you find, that as well, that there's, as we've been saying a lot lately, the supply chain and logistics has a seat at the strategy table these days that perhaps they didn't, say a decade ago?
Absolutely. I would say when you think about a lot of the changes that have been happening as of late, many of them, tariff related, has made and forced, let's just say, brands, even back to the COVID time, had them build new muscles that they didn't even know existed, but to really sustain and be successful through these times. And when you think about operations, you think about manufacturing, you think about the entire global supply chain, it has gotten a much bigger spotlight than it ever has in the past, especially in the world of global e-commerce. So not to say that it wasn't an important key pillar of brands, but I think with everything happening, it's just gotten a lot more emphasis, a lot more investment, rightfully so.
That's where, despite this, global trade uncertainty that's out there, global e-commerce continues to grow, in so many markets and again, across, borders. How do you kind of characterize, the current environment? And let's say more specifically for a brand that's, ready to, they may have, some, international capabilities today, but they're ready to scale, that business, to the next level. How do you kind of explain, what's going on and what they need to be, watching out for, but where there's big opportunity as well?
Yeah, and I think as I see it right now, and I know we spoke very briefly about COVID, but I think as you think about the brands who accelerated strategies through COVID are now the ones that made those permanent strategies in place that are helping them be successful, to be very honest. And those are the ones where I'm seeing the acceleration, the fuel being poured on the overall international expansion plan, because they're very much focused on the brand and how to accelerate. And I think that international, one of the things that's been quite an interesting pillar is, and I look back to my 14-year-old career when I started, right? But when you think about early days of international e-commerce, especially as a U.S. brand and the resilience of just the U.S. market as a whole, many brands viewed international as an afterthought. And I think one of the emphasis now is international is a key pillar for every single brand that we speak to about how do I expand it? But it's not just about how do I expand it and grow. It's about how do I do it responsibly, profitably. The days of growing top line without bottom line following are days of the past as we see it. So really, when I look to answer your question specifically, brands are looking at key opportunities where they can really drive wind in their sail from an international expansion and an overall revenue perspective. But they're also doing it in areas where it's healthy margin and yield for the business in order to drive a profitable international e-commerce business that mirrors that of domestic.
It's great to hear that, again, the brands who are committing, to that global journey. Do you find that it's your job in a lot of cases to say, well, how do you properly align resources, to the ambitious goals that brand, may have? So again, giving them the best chance, of success, really, because that's worst thing we've seen, obviously, is, big goals, but under-resourced.
Yeah. And I think when I look at the Globally job and the Globally role as a platform, it is really focused on de-risking international expansion for brands so that they can do what's most important for their business, which is focus on scaling the brand, the growth, the acceleration without the fear that you're going to lose margin on the other side of an international transaction, right? So when you think about duty, tax, tariff management, we remove that headache for them. We make sure that they are geared up for international in a way that a customer would expect to buy locally. When we think about payments and we think about orchestrating all of the remittances and the compliance around an international transaction, there's a lot for a brand to consume. And then layer on top of that, the tariff uncertainty and what is shifting on such a rapid basis, to have that as a thought and a distraction for brand and a risk that they have to think through every time they want to be able to accelerate international is something where we come into play. And then layer that into just the evolution of our platform, right? We really were a de-risking international localization platform when we first began. We then transitioned into a data company, right? Globally has hit a certain scale that many, many brands are after, right? How do you work with the thousands and thousands of merchants that you do powering international e-commerce? And how can you help me as a brand set me up for success on my international journey? So it went from de-risking and localizing the experience to be able to emulate what a customer would want to buy locally, to then layering data on top of that to be able to help brands drive insights, drive investment where it needs to be driven to help them scale and hit the achieved goals that they want to be able to get after. And then really it's just a lot of data, a lot of reporting, a lot of simplicity that really we help remove from their overall books.
Well, let's shift gears a little bit. I was at a international conference in Montreal last week, and talking. It happened to be a food conference, but talking to many retailers and brands, they're thinking about diversifying and expanding beyond America. For example, they talk about Mexico and they talk about different markets. So, if we think about it from the lens of the consumer, what are you learning about the appetite for cross-border and the best approaches, and does this vary in your experience? So what can you say about the consumer buying behaviors? That's a big, broad question, but maybe you can tackle it is there still lots of opportunity for brands to travel the world and retailers travel the world with their value proposition?
I mean, the short answer is yes. I think the underpinning of a consumer expectation is a seamless transaction, a domestic-like transaction, no matter where they live in the world. They expect to buy locally. They expect the experience to be one that is no different than them shopping at a local store around the corner from them. But from an expectation perspective, I don't see that shifting. Obviously, when you get into some of the friction that may face these customers, it's how do we help remove that, yet build it into a seamless, simplified way for that customer, no matter where they live in the world. So whether it be Mexico, which has been one of our largest, call it growth trade lanes over the years, which recently slowed down over the past 12 to 18 months for many of the brands, it's more about where and how do I reach that shopper in a way that's going to be as simple as them buying around the corner. So I don't think the expectation from a consumer has shifted much. Still
an appetite, still interested. Now, I'm going to ask you a funny question. If you had $1 left to spend, and if you're a brand or retailer, which market would you, and let's say you're based in Canada, a lot of my audience based in Canada, what international market would deserve the most interest, the most investigation? If you were making the decision, I gave you $1, where would you go?
I think right now the narrative hasn't changed with Canada being the number one trade lane for many of our U.S. merchants. Obviously the demand is there, the consumer sentiment is there. I think that from some of the turbulence we saw, maybe a year and a half ago, I think that's completely stabilized, which I think is great for U.S. brands. So Canada is definitely continues to dominate from a number one trade lane for our U.S. merchants. And then opportunity wise, I think when you think about the Middle East, you think about the GCC markets, you think about Qatar, you think about Kuwait, you think about Saudi, you think about really some markets that have always thrived and continue to thrive through some of the turbulence that we've seen. So
Canada for the American merchants,
but all my Canadians out there, keep buying.
Well, I know there's a lot of interest in Canada, of course, continuing to work in the U.S., but also looking at India, because there's a whole lot of people in India. But it's a super complex market. I imagine you do some business there, yeah?
Yeah, and I think when we look at it right now, the best for cross-border e-commerce, when we think about the expansion, you think about it from a level of obviously investment and what you would get out of it, but you also think about it from a level of complexity, right? And you mentioned Canada and you mentioned India. Those are two very different markets, right? From an appetite of growth, both drive a huge yield. But when you think about the complexities of Canada versus that of India, much easier market from a Canadian perspective, from a direct-to-consumer, online, overall international experience to be able to adhere to. And when we think about India, the market's there. I think that the attraction is there for many, many brands, but I haven't seen many crack it in a way that I've seen brands crack Canada.
So Matthew, you kind of mentioned this, early on, just in your kind of introduction to Global E, but wanted to kind of shift towards, retailers and brands, global strategies, and tactics. But we always like to start with goal setting. And you kind of mentioned, the profitable growth, goal that certainly you're hearing loud and clear, from brands. How have you seen that kind of, evolve over the years, where we have seen, periods of time where it was more market share, and top line, driven, but obviously that's, kind of led us, to where we are today. But do you see those, investment horizons, kind of changing, with brands? Again, you mentioned how committed they are to kind of global now. Does that, match, with where their patience levels to really start to see kind of the ROI, really grow?
Yeah, I mean, I have not been in a conversation over the past 2 years that hasn't had the word profitability in the discussion, right? So to the earlier point when Michael mentioned supply chain, logistics, creative solutions, around that world has become a key focus, right? And that's from the point where you manufacture, whether you be China dependent or not. Many have moved and shifted away from that China strategy prior to even all of the, the uncertainty that's hit. So I think many were on their way before that, but it starts with where that order is manufactured. It then layers into, hey, when I bring a good into a market like the US, there's a duty paid on that overall product, right? Brands are now saying, when I re-export those, how do I get that money back? That leads to IEPA and the reclaims and all of the fun that's happened in the US. But long story short, the ability to reclaim duty has become a forefront, has become a discussion in every conversation I have with brands, because they are looking at every single opportunity in how to accelerate profitability within an international transaction, whether it be in their own four walls or whether it be arenas where I can help remove friction and do that for them. So duty drawback, a big piece, logistics and supply chain, just as much of a focus right now. And then all the localization conversion things that we're doing obviously continue to become a strategy.
Though you've just listed off, probably I think the biggest profitability drivers, right, that we're seeing out there. All the above, really are kind of contributing to that, bottom line.
Absolutely. I mean, even when you think about Europe, right? I know everything happening in Europe. July is looming. Some markets within the EU have already started assessing advancement fees that, brands didn't expect. These are the arenas where, yes, I can de-risk, but then there's a real cost to a consumer, right? And then the question becomes, well, how can I serve that international order as if it's one that's already landed in the market? And that's where brands are starting to really think creatively of, okay, it's not so much around the manufacturing, which I've now solved for. It's not so much around the duty and tax reclaim programs, which I've solved for. It's now, do I forward position inventory in a market for my fast lane sellers? Do I try to transact in a way that allows me to leverage my entity footprint on a global basis at less than retail? There's a lot of strategies right now globally that are happening with brands to figure out how can I serve that customer in the EU more efficiently and more profitably, even with the changes that are looming ahead.
Are you seeing a lot of that kind of buffer inventory, that build up, in certain markets? Again, are the balance sheets, like able to kind of absorb, that type of, capital investment?
I mean, yes. I think when I look at it right now, and the brand, we support brands of all different shapes and sizes, right? So it's difficult for me to compare a brand that, is call it a mid-market brand versus a global brand with inventory all over the world. But when you think about the core strategy, even when I think about profitability and you think about it from a digital and a technical landscape, brands are trying to figure out, how do I decouple the multi-site strategy that I've built out over the years? How do I serve the world from a single technical website, yet still have localized experiences, translations, different themes for shoppers in all of these international locales, so that I don't build up tech debt as part of this overall strategy, right? And then once you have that single site strategy, which is where I'm seeing many of the brands head, even those legacy global brands, of which I will not name, that had 200 plus websites, they're trying to figure out, how do I get back to one? And how do I not impact the local experience of what these shoppers are used to with me having built out a local website strategy market by market over the years. And then once you have that infrastructure in place, brands are saying, okay, I have inventory positioned all over the world. If I have a shopping cart, I don't care where that inventory fulfills from, but it needs to be what is going to be most optimal and most profitable for that international transaction, whether it leverages one market or whether it leverages two markets from a fulfillment perspective. So all that complexity is where we insulate the brands from thinking about any of it. And that's those conversations that are just becoming much more strategic. Then we have a bunch of tools that will allow you to sell internationally. It's a much bigger game than that now.
We've been talking about brands moving around the world, but what's your advice and what's your experience? As you've been saying, the variety of different ways you can go to market, whether it's marketplace, franchise stores, owned stores. We've seen all kinds of permutations. But today, for those brands looking to, let's say they get that simplified website, beyond that, what's your advice for those who want to maintain brand integrity and some of their best foot forwards?
Yeah, I mean, implement globally tomorrow. No,
All right, thanks for joining us.
You, John, and everything else is great, right?
Yeah.
No, I think
part of it. Good partners, like really good partners, right? Who are experienced in doing this is I think a big jumping off platform for anybody that wants to go international. You don't have to do it alone. In other words, right?
Yeah. No, completely joking. But when I look at the overall strategy for the brands, it's very much built on digital, right? The ones that are accelerating, the ones that are thriving, the ones, that really are, I would say, creating a new category for themselves when it comes to just growth and acceleration of that new brand presence are the ones that are built on digital. I see it, even from the days when COVID forced that issue, but fast forward to where we are now, those are the brands that are built for the changes that we've got and the ones that are able to maneuver and stay ahead of where everyone is. But then to your point, layer in, smarter inventory allocation, right? Yep. That conversation is a thought for all. How they all, get there might vary based off of size and dimension of the brand, but inventory allocation is a big one, right? And then you think about carrier diversification. One of the things that we obviously do is we partner with many different logistics providers, and logistics has become a key pillar to help brands serve international in an efficient way. You never know when a carrier is going to go on strike. You never know when you're going to have that ability to maneuver, and it's just become table stakes for brands to be able to keep that international business running in a way that it does. And then from a profitability perspective, the duty optimization, the pricing strategies, these are ones that just aren't shifting. If anything, are becoming more complex as the brands look to scale, not just their digital storefront, but then their in-market distribution and or, wholesale agreements to help from a brand presence perspective. So it's become the core.
Well, I love your framework of table stakes, because I often think of table stakes and differentiators. So, there's a bunch of things you need to do, and what in your experience has been separating those who are really mastering this? What are the couple of tips for them, and how do you, what do you see when these brands are really doing a great job balancing these many, many, many goals, and they're differentiating with the following kind of three things or two things? What would those things be that will really make you stand apart and drive success? And as you say, right from the top, profitability in international markets?
Yeah, I think, when I look at the portfolio and see those that are thriving, the ones that seem to be, I would say, lapping the others are the ones that take risks. The ones that are unafraid to really begin selling to the world, the ones that are unafraid of, having the adaptability and the ability to pivot and become agile and change. So I think when you think about the brands that are doing that today, those are, and I go back to it, the ones that think digital first. Okay. I continue to see it. And, when I think digital first and I think focus on the brand and being unique as a brand, these are the ones that I see flying right now and accelerating and being successful. And then layer in all the fundamental and I would call it unsexy things that were top of mind, like we spoke about logistics, duty, tariffs, but having the foundation for a profitable business is key.
If I'm competing in a value segment and you've probably got two competitors that literally didn't exist 5 years ago, Temu and Shein, and they're pretty powerful competitors globally. What's your advice? Is it a proof of concept model to make sure you can succeed in that market? Not everybody, of course, is playing in that same space, but if you're anywhere connected to a value or a substitution, affordability, a big issue around the world, what's your advice there?
This is always one that the brands who do it well stand out. And I think it goes back to my previous comment about being unique and creating a brand, right? And certainly that's not what I'm doing at Globally. I'm more helping the other things that we've spoken about. But when I look at the brands that are truly differentiating, it's not so much about the price. It's about the emotional connection with their consumers that are doing, really, really cool things when it comes to attracting the right customer who is built for that unique brand experience that these brands have invested a ton in. So for me, it's being unique as a brand. And I think those that do it well, who they are, and they continue to soar. those that are not innovating and not finding those, innovative, unique, curated ways to, really speak to a consumer, whether it be domestic or international, are the ones that struggle. And then you get yourself into chasing sale, which is a dangerous place to go.
I love the comment around, the risk takers really are lapping, the field, and yet I'm sure those are very calculated, risks, right? Margin management, has certainly been I think a hot topic these days. I mean, can you talk a little to, how some of these, especially successful brands internationally, are managing, their margins when there's so many factors, right? They're fighting against, are they absorbing, some of those, rising costs, or are they just explaining in some eloquent way to the end consumer why the price is, what it is, and passing perhaps some of that on? What are you seeing out there in general? I know every company differs.
Yeah, I think the first step is understanding how to actually measure profitability accurately on an international transaction. Believe it or not, that is not table stakes. Not every brand understands all the cost implications of what comes into measuring profitability on an international transaction, which is much different than that of domestic. So number one, having the foundation to measure profitability is key. And then number two, depending on the brand strategy, like I mentioned, I wouldn't say brands are looking to take costs and pass them directly to customers. That's never a strategy that's out of the gate that a brand ever recommends, or a brand is looking for us to lean into. Hey, take that tariff and just throw it on the shopper. It's not one that we hear. If anything, they're taking what you mentioned, Jim, calculated risks, right? In either waiting and understanding, okay, let me understand what this tariff means. Let me understand if this tariff is actually going to stick. And more importantly, let me find ways as a brand to lower my overall cost, whether it be all those things that we spoke about, in order to make sure that my customer's not impacted. So when I see it across the board, it's not so much how do I tack on additional costs for the customer, it's how do I work more efficiently as a brand to make sure that my customer isn't impacted on the overall price point for the product and the quality of what we're trying to serve up to them.
It's where we've been having a lot of conversation around global pricing architecture, and I think even more so relevant, in a AI crawler-driven, world, that transparency of what that same product, might cost in one market, versus another. Again, thinking of, some of these best-in-class, like innovative, leaders that you've been alluding to. How do they really approach, global pricing? Are they really taking a global, perspective on it, or do they really react to specific market conditions in a country or region?
Yeah, I think the best way to explain a brand's approach internationally is one size does not fit all. And when I look at what brands are looking at, there's no way that they can sell this jacket worldwide for the same price point, the same experience, the same strategy, country by country, because it varies greatly. The duty and the tariff strategies are completely different when you look at a shopper in the EU or the UK who is expecting to see VAT included in the price, versus a Canadian shopper that may be very much used to paying provincial sales tax at the point of checkout. But once we bring the word duty up, that overall shopping experience ends. So I think depending on the country, there's a unique strategy for each. And when I look at the overall strategy from brands, it's not a one size fits all. And when you start to think about the global brands who have sell-through and distribution and stores, they're looking to make sure they're not competing with themselves, right? So that's pricing alignment across all the different channels so that that consumer doesn't think, hey, can I go here to get that product, that same product cheaper? No. Right. Build the alignment so that no matter where your shopper wants to shop, he or she has the ability to do that in a simple way.
Well, let's wrap up. It's been very generous with your time and insights. I guess the last question is advice, and I'll put it in. We'll put it in a frame of saying, listen, there's many customers you talk to that sell around the world, and in that early conversation, what's one thing you might say? You know what? I wouldn't do that. Our learnings are that that's probably not the best approach. You've given us lots of positive things that they can do. Is there any one thing that jumps out to say, that's kind of a mistake that, whether intended or unintended, maybe it makes sense, but it doesn't really? What might jump out at you as that one example?
I think the one example is to go global, to be honest. I think as simply put as it is, many brands are still nervous about opening up the world. And when you turn away traffic of consumers that are finding you without you wanting them or putting any investment to allow them to find you, why not serve them? So for me, it's go global and it's accelerate. When others are slowing down, you should be, really putting it in the fifth gear, and you should be accelerating, because those that don't are the ones that are getting left behind.
Well, as my partner Steve Dennis often says, it's sometimes now, particularly thinking about risk, it's more risky now not to take risks, so to speak, than it is to take the risk. The higher risk is waiting for the disruption to hit you. Well, listen, Matthew, this has been such a great conversation. Thanks so much for joining Jim and I, my special co-host. Jim, thanks for joining me on the mic as well for this special episode. Matthew, if people want to get in touch, whether they're in Canada or wherever they're listening to, are you a LinkedIn guy? What's the best way to get in touch and tap into Global E's expertise?
I would say visit our website, global-e.com, and talk with an international expert, and we'll serve you instantly. Excellent. And thank you very much, Michael. Appreciate the time as always. Thanks, Jim.
Thank you.
Thanks for tuning in. Be sure and give us that 5-star rating and follow us on your favorite podcast platform, and check out our newly refreshed YouTube and LinkedIn pages.